Alright, so let's pick it back up with trying to figure out some collision detection this time. We've got it so that our player is now moving, our gems and our baddies are not yet moving, but that's okay. What we want to be able to do is figure out when and if our player is colliding with any of the other objects in this game, so we're going to go ahead and modify the collide method inside of game object, and then we can add in some checks for it to make sure that it's doing as we would like it to. So now, I'm going to run this just so I can point at the images. What I want to figure out is when and if my player object ends up on top of any of my other game piece objects. So what I'm likely going to need to know is whenever I'm talking about this collision method, I will be inside of one of the objects. It's possible that the object that I'm talking about is the player, so the built-in X, Y, and size will be for the player, but I'll want to know things about where that gem is located. But it's also possible that I am inside of the gem or the baddie already, and I want to use the gem or the baddie to check that collision detection. So I'll know information about where the gem exists in its X and Y position and then its size overall, and I'll want to know information about that player. Either way, what that means is there is information that I'm going to have to pass into this collision method, this collide method, that will be the other object's location and size, so that I can actually detect when and if they collide. Because if I only know information about where the gem is, I have no way to check collision with anything else because I don't have enough information. So we're going to have to pass in some information. So we're going to call it other X, other Y, and other size, just so that we have a way to talk about any other objects that we want to know when and if they collide with them. So whether we're thinking about this as I'm a gem and I want to know when I collide with the player, or I'm the player and I want to know when I collide with the baddie, or however it's going to work, there's going to be built-in X, Y, and size that will belong to whatever object you're referring to, and then there'll be the ones that you'll need to pass in that will be that other X, Y, and size. Alright, so now we're going to think about some collision detection. So I've switched over to my iPad to draw out some of the scenarios because I think that'll make that easier. In our version right now, the thing that we're going to draw out is I'm going to assume that right now the object that I'm dealing with is the gem, just so that I can get a visual of what's going on. I know that the gem doesn't actually move, but I want to think about if I'm the gem, so that right here, here's my X, here's my Y. That's the one that I want to consider. And I'm going to check with the players, so the player's information is going to be passed into me. So this for me would then be other X, other Y right up here. So the object that I'm dealing with is I'm the gem. I want to know information about where I am in location in relation to the player, which is now my other X and my other Y. So now there's lots of ways that these two pieces can collide with one another. Remember, the player is going to be the one that moves, the gem is stationary for us. So collisions can happen in this fashion, by right edge, left edge. They can happen in this fashion, by left edge, right edge. They can happen in this fashion, by bottom edge, top edge. Or they can happen in this fashion of top edge, bottom edge. Yes, technically they can happen exactly at the same time of hitting those two corners, which is then both a right left and a bottom top at the exact same moment. If it's something in this sort, one of those two things is going to happen first. Yeah, absolutely. But there are lots of ways that these two objects can collide with one another. So we'll have to think about a bunch of different things happening. And luckily, in the end, it's not too bad of a fix to actually think about all four cases kind of at the same time. So what I really want us to do right now is think about the fact that for our player piece and for our object, which for us right now is our gem, we really have kind of this like extending line that goes all the way through on all edges of where the player and the object are. So our object, our gem that's right here, has those extending lines. So we want to think about having that plane involved, and that if we cross one of those two planes, well, we're not quite there yet, but that if we cross both of those two planes, then we're seated at that object. And the reason that's important to think about is because if I think about only moving in the X direction, and I want to think about, well, let's say this object's rightmost edge hitting my object's rightmost edge, so the player hitting my rightmost edge. This is in fact where they collide. However, this should not be considered a collision for me, nor should this, even though the x values are in fact crossing over one another. We really want to think about only when it's the case of you're hitting in the x direction, but it's also true that you're within the y bounds as well. And this really isn't too bad to think about. So the first thing that we want to consider is, let's erase these to not have too many extra lines on my screen. The first case that we want to consider is, okay, let's say that we want to deal with this edge colliding with this edge. It's right here. The thing we want to talk about then is that this edge on the object that we consider is really just talking about, well, this is just the x value. So we want to know if this dot x, which is the one that we're talking about right there, our x value, is colliding with the x value that's over here. And that x value in this case is going to be other x. However, it's other x plus whatever the size of that object is. So it's other x plus other size. And what we want to know is when they cross over, meaning that our this dot x has actually become less than that other x plus other size. If you really want to think about this the other way and think about that other x plus other size is now bigger than this dot x, you can write it that way as well. Either way is fine there. But in the sense that now the player has moved and their green edge has overtaken that red edge. So that's true, and that considers this case. However, right now, this also says that anytime this edge is bigger, the green edge is bigger than the red edge, we're colliding. So this would be considered a collision if this is the only check I would do. This would also be considered a collision. And anything within this realm would also be considered a collision. Simply because I'm only checking one edge of the piece. So the other side, the other thing that I want to think about in terms of the x direction to deal with all of this nonsense that's over here that's definitely not a collision, is the fact that there's another edge in the x direction. And what I mean by that is that there is this edge. Oops, I was going to do that in highlighter. There is this edge, this yellow edge of our player piece, and there's also this orange edge of our gem piece, of our object. So in order for them to actually truly be colliding with one another, the thing that happens is that the green edge overtakes the red edge. This is a collision, but the yellow edge is still less than that orange edge. Okay, let's look at that again. Green overtakes red, but yellow is still less than orange. That makes sense here, which then would prevent us from dealing with this situation, because once they are, in fact, that the yellow edge is bigger than that orange edge, they are not colliding in any way. They are just passing and breezing right by one another. The other reason that this logic and idea is helpful to us is because it also now, in essence, is thinking about this situation, where this is the collision on the other side, and now the yellow edge of that player piece is colliding and overtaking backwards that orange edge of the gem piece. So what I also want to think about is at the same time, in that exact same moment, let's think, our orange piece here, well, that's going to be our x value plus our size. So I'm going to continue using this to make it very obvious what I'm talking about, this dot x plus this dot size. That actually still should be bigger than that yellow edge, which is then talking about other x. So both of those things need to be true at the same time to mean that in some way the two edges are in fact overtaking one another either positively or negatively. So that's the first thing that we want to consider. And those two things have to happen at the same time. Okay, great. So now once those two things are happening, we still have a little bit of work to do because right now, I'm going to delete some of this extra annotation so that we can still keep going. Because right now, what happens is just because my yellow and green edges line up in the way that I want them to, yellow edges here, green edges here, orange edges here, great. Just because the yellow and the green edge match up with that red and orange edge, I could be way up here or way down here and not actually yet colliding with that gem piece at all. So once we know that this is true, these two things have to be true, we're saying at the same time. Have to be true at the same time. Next, check. Okay, so now the next thing that we need to do is then think about everything in the y direction. So let's add in some colors to distinguish the y directions and y edges for the player and the gem again. So the gem's gonna have a pink and a brown. And for the player, I don't know, let's use a blue and purple like that. Okay, so now everything that we had done in the x direction is also going to be the case when we're talking about things in the y direction. So with this time, now what we need to think about is we're going to have interplay between the pink and the purple edge for when the purple finally overtakes the pink, or conversely, when the brown and the blue overtake one another in that way. So we're going to have the pink and the purple intersecting one another, or the brown and the blue intersecting one another. All the while, this needs to be the case that the x is also true so that we end up with actual collision in that way. Okay, so what that means is we need to check when the purple finally becomes bigger than the pink. So let's think about what each of those edges should be named. For our player, this is going to be our other y. And for our player, this is other y plus other size. And for our gem, we've got y and y plus size. Remember those ones being this dot, but I'm going to leave that off for a second. So the first thing we want to do is we want to think about that pink and the purple. So that would be the situation of this dot y finally gets overtaken, being that it is now smaller than the player piece, which in this case is other y plus other size. And also at the same time, and it's also true that now we're thinking about the blue and the browns, that our brown piece, which is this dot y plus this dot size, is in fact still larger than, wait, let's think about this. Yes, is still in fact larger than that blue piece that's up here that is our other y. And so what I mean by that is either we're in this situation, nope, don't get the sidewall. Either we're in this situation right here where the purple overtakes the pink, but the brown and the blue still make sense, or we're in the situation where the purple has overtaken the pink a long time ago, but we've just reached the place where now the brown is in fact larger than the blue. Yes, that's what we mean. However, our last step, the last thing that I want to think about is for our game right now, what's going on is right now, do we want to consider this to be a collision, yes or no? If I make it so that those two edges are equal, are they in fact colliding? Are they touching? In our situation, I think that we're going to say yes. In other situations, we might say no. It has to actually completely overtake that piece. But what that means is in all of our operators of equality or inequality, we also want to add in that equal sign to all of them, which I know that isn't the Java version of writing that out. But that's enough to get us to a place right now where we'll be able to turn it into code, because right now we're still talking about pseudocode. Okay, great. So this should get us enough to be able to go code it. So let's go code it now. All right, we're back to programming. So here we go. I'm going to make this window a little bit smaller so that I can see the code that I had written out in our drawing on my iPad, so we can kind of copy the ideas that we'd already logicked out. So here we go. the first thing that we want to consider is our x direction. So when we think about that x direction, we want if this dot x is in fact less than or equal to let's put it together, other x plus other size. Now, most of the time we can bank on IntelliJ and Java knowing exactly what we mean when we use addition or subtraction with inequalities. I, as a math teacher, just like to be really, really precise and put in those parentheses, but just be careful that you are opening and closing the right amount of parentheses there. And that and operator, meaning our and symbol, we also want to check if this dot x, and again, let's add in those parentheses, if this dot x plus this dot size is in fact greater than or equal to our other x in this case. So that's the first check that we want to do. So that says that our x's then overlapped. True that x's overlapped. But now check y's. And what I mean by that is when I say check this and then next check the other thing means that I'm going to make those be nested if statements for me. So this must be true first about my x direction, and then I also need to check it about the y. The great thing here is that that's also the case vice versa. Even if I want to consider an up-down type of collision, it also still needed to be true that my x's were in the right position. So I could flip-flop these in either order. I chose to do x's first, then y's. You can do it the other way around, but you are still checking for all four sides collision options. Okay, so then let's add in if this dot y, not size, this dot y is, we said less than or equal to, and let's use some parentheses, other y plus other size, close those parentheses, and also at the same time, let's open some parentheses, this dot y plus this dot size is greater than or equal to our other y. Okay, great. And if both of those two cases are true, meaning we've come to this situation where both the x direction and the y direction, now it's true that the y's overlapped also, then what we'd want to do is we'd want to return true. We got to a place where we found a condition, all of our conditions were met, and we actually are intersecting. So first we checked the x direction, we found that to be true, and so then we checked the y direction, we also found that to be true, so we should return true. If we don't find those two conditions to be true, we should still return false, meaning that we aren't yet in fact colliding. So from here, now that we've done all of this, our method of collision, or collide as we're calling it, is set. It is exactly the logic that we wanted, so let's close that image and let's make this larger again so we can keep going. And what we're going to do from here is continue on and actually do that check, because now this method collide, because it exists in GameObject, it exists for gems, for players, and for baddies. So we can run over to our graphics game, and now we're going to want to try to actually do that check and see when things are colliding. Now, because right now we only have a singular gem, a singular player, and a singular baddie, who is checking the collision with what thing right now doesn't really make a huge difference. It's going to be about the same amount of logic regardless because there's one of each. However, later on in our game, we know that we'll have lots of baddies and lots of gems, and we'll want to be able to distinguish between collision with a gem and collision with a baddie. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say in our situation, let's let the object be the gem, and we'll pass in player's location to check for collision. And then we'll do that same idea where we're going to let the object, second thing, so this is actually a comment, we'll let the object be the baddie, and again we'll pass in the player location. Okay, so let's first do it with the gem, just like we had done in our demo. So now we have G1 is what we've called our gem, And we're going to call that method collide. So now it says we need to pass in an x, a y, and a size. So we're going to do that of our player. So this will be p1.x, p1.y, and p1.size. So if that's the case, for right now, let's just go ahead and put a little debugging print statement in here. Player and gem collided. Okay, and then we're going to do that exact same check, but then this time we'll do it for our baddie. So we'll say if that b1 collides with our p1.x, p1.y, p1.size. If that's the case, then also we'll add in another print statement. Baddie and player collided. Collided. There we go. Okay, so now let's test out to see if our collision detection is doing as we want. In the end, yes, we'll want to add in the correct actions of what happens when these things collide, but for now, let's just make sure it's working the way we want it to. So let's run our program. And let's try this now. We'll keep our console in mind, so let's maybe move this over so I can see the console printout. Let's try to collect, do we see that? We are colliding with that gem, which again, later on we'll be collecting it. Let's try in the Y direction, working out there, working out there. Seems to be working on all edges of that gem. Great, so let's go try it with our baddie that's over here. Working out. Okay, got to the other side. Working out over there. Great, let's try it from the top. Seems to be doing the case. And from the bottom. All right, so we've got our collision fully working. The next thing that we're going to do is try to add in some of the actions of what would happen when these things collide, and then eventually hopefully get to a place where we've spawned lots and lots of baddies and lots of gems. So those will be our next video or